Welcome back to True Crime Mysteries. If you think you already know everything about the Chris Watts case, I want you to pause, because the story most of us have been told doesn't start where we think it does. We always focus on the explosion of violence on August 13th. But that wasn't the beginning. That was the end. The real starting point is thousands of miles away, in North Carolina. And it's hidden inside prison letters that Chris Watts wrote years after his conviction. In those letters is a confession that completely changes how we understand this case. Chris admitted that weeks before the murders, he tried to kill his unborn son using oxycodone. This wasn't about a divorce. It wasn't about snapping in the heat of the moment. It was about erasing his family quietly. So the real question isn't why he snapped. It's how many times he tried to end their lives before he finally succeeded. Today, we're continuing our analysis. I went through the letters and rebuilt the timeline to expose the calculation that most people missed. And to understand it, we have to talk about poison, before we talk about strangulation. Most discussions of the Chris Watts case begin with the affair. Nicole Kessinger. The secret dates. The emotional distance. Others start with the early hours of August 13th, when Shannon walked through the front door for the last time. But if we start there, we fall straight into the trap Chris set. We focus on the explosion and ignore the fuse. To understand what really happened, we have to go back weeks earlier. Back to North Carolina. And we have to stop thinking about hands for a moment, and start thinking about pills. While sitting in a Wisconsin prison, Chris began writing letters to an author named Sherilyn Cadle. When those letters became public, they revealed admissions that were never part of the original investigation. In one of them, Chris confessed to something chilling. While visiting his parents in North Carolina, he secretly gave Shannon a large dose of oxycodone before she went to bed. Shannon didn't take painkillers regularly. She was pregnant. What he gave her was extremely dangerous. This wasn't an accident. Poison is the weapon of a coward, but it's also the weapon of someone who plans. You have to get it. Hide it. Choose the right moment. And then wait. This wasn't an argument gone wrong. This was a deliberate biological attack on his wife and unborn child. Chris later admitted his goal wasn't to kill Shannon outright. He wanted her to lose the baby. He believed it would be easier to leave his marriage if she wasn't pregnant. He wanted a tragedy that looked natural, something that would solve his problem for him. That night, Shannon went to bed. And soon after, she became violently ill. We know from her text messages and online searches during that trip that she was terrified. She was vomiting, weak, and confused. She told friends she felt like she was dying. She thought it was a pregnancy complication or a severe illness. She had no idea her husband had drugged her. What stands out here is the coldness. Chris didn't rush to help her. He didn't call for medical care. He watched. He waited. Not to comfort her, but to see if it worked. He was waiting for the baby's heart to stop. That's not a husband. That's a predator. But the plan failed. Despite the sickness, despite the poisoning, Nico survived. Shannon's body fought through it. The baby's heart kept beating. This moment matters more than people realize. If that poisoning had worked, this case might look very different today. Chris could have played the role of the grieving father. He could have distanced himself slowly. He might have walked away without ever being charged with murder. But Nico lived. And because of that, Chris felt trapped. The easy, quiet way out was gone. When they returned to Colorado, the clock was ticking. The pregnancy was progressing. The affair was intensifying. He had already tried to kill his son once, and failed. That tells us something critical. By the time August 13th arrived, Chris Watts was not a man who suddenly snapped. He was someone who had already crossed the line weeks earlier. The intent never changed. In North Carolina, he tried to stop a heart with a pill. In Colorado, he realized he would have to use his hands. And that shift didn't make him a different person, it revealed who he already was. This wasn't a change of heart. It was just a change in tactics. Chris Watts had already made the decision that his family had to be removed from his life. The argument that morning didn't cause anything. It simply gave him something to point to later. An excuse, not a trigger. When people talk about the timeline of that morning, they usually focus on the neighbor's security footage. Specifically, the Vivint smart home system. The Watts house wasn't just a home. It was wired, monitored, and constantly recording. Every door. Every window. Every movement. This wasn't just an alarm system. It was a digital diary, quietly logging the pulse of that house minute by minute. Chris could lie to the police. He could lie to Shannon's friends. But he couldn't lie to the servers tracking his movements in real time. So let's look at what the data actually shows on the morning of August 13, 2018. According to Chris, he woke up, had an emotional conversation with Shannon, killed her, and then calmly loaded her body into the truck before placing the girls in the back seat. A clean, simple sequence. But the Vivint logs tell a very different story. What shows up in the data isn't calm or linear. It's chaotic. And one detail stands out immediately: the basement. The Watts home had 3 levels. Bedrooms upstairs. The main floor connected to the garage. And then the basement below. If you're moving a body from the master bedroom to the garage, there's one logical path. Down one set of stairs and straight out the door. There is no reason to go into the basement. It's a dead end. It adds time. It adds effort. And yet, the sensors were triggered. Machines don't lie. People do. The logs show motion and door activity in the basement during the exact window when Chris claimed he was loading the truck. That's where the timeline falls apart. Basement sensors don't activate by accident. Someone had to be down there. So here's where things get uncomfortable. If Chris was upstairs dealing with Shannon, or in the garage loading the truck, who triggered the basement sensor? For years, there's been a theory that Chris didn't act alone. Officially, he did. He pleaded guilty. Case closed. But when you slow down the timestamps, there are moments where activity overlaps in ways that shouldn't be possible for one person. There's even a window where the garage door is opening while movement is detected inside the house at the same time. So I want to ask you this. Do you believe Chris was moving bodies alone in a panic? Or was someone else already downstairs? Because if he was alone, the movements make no sense. Why carry a pregnant woman down an extra flight of stairs only to bring her back up again? It defies logic. It defies physics. Unless the body was already down there. Or unless the children were. Now think about the basement layout. It had window wells, exit points, blind spots. If someone wanted to enter or leave the house without being seen by the doorbell camera or the neighbor's surveillance, the basement would be the way to do it. The data shows the house was awake. It shows movement in the deepest, darkest part of the home during the exact moment the family was being destroyed. That means the story of a man snapping and dragging his wife to the truck may be covering something far more complex, and possibly far more crowded. The Vivint system didn't just log doors opening. It recorded frantic, unexplained movement. And that basement sensor? That's the glitch in Chris Watts' matrix. It's the detail that suggests he's still holding something back. Now, we've spent years dissecting the GPS data from Chris's work truck. We know when he left the driveway. We know the route. We know he went to server 319. That GPS trail destroyed his initial lie about going straight to work. But while everyone was watching the map, they missed the most important question. Not where the truck went, but what it was carrying. Chris wasn't driving a personal vehicle. He was driving an Anadarko fleet truck. And if you know anything about fleet vehicles in the oil and gas industry, you know these trucks are monitored obsessively. Speed, braking, fuel usage, idle time, engine diagnostics. They're computers on wheels. But there's one system almost never discussed in this case, and it could change everything. The occupant classification system. In simple terms, it's the weight sensor in the passenger seat. You've seen it before. Put groceries on the seat, and the airbag light flickers or the seatbelt alarm activates. That seat knows when someone is sitting there. It measures pressure. Now think about Chris's version of events. He said the girls were in the back seat. He said Shannon was on the floorboard in the rear. That means the front passenger seat should have been empty. Zero weight. But here's the problem. The investigation never released data from those internal sensors. The discovery file is over 2,000 pages long. GPS logs are there. Messages are there. But the telematics report showing internal seat data? Missing. And that matters. Because if that passenger seat sensor registered roughly 50 or 60 kilograms, the weight of a small adult woman, then Chris is lying. Either about where the body was, or about who was in the truck. Let's follow that logic. If Shannon was deceased in the back, the front seat is empty. But if someone was sitting there, buckled in, leaving the neighborhood before sunrise, who was it? An accomplice? Or Shannon, incapacitated but still alive? And there's another layer. Fleet trucks also track load and suspension weight. Anadarko monitors this to prevent overloading. A sudden increase of nearly 100 kilograms, the combined weight of Shannon and the children, would likely register the moment the truck was loaded. So ask yourself this. Was that data ignored because it didn't matter? Or was it withheld because it complicated the narrative? Technology designed to record truth exists here. Yet we're told the GPS is all that matters. We know the truck moved. But without load and seat data, we don't truly know who, or what, was inside it. And that silence in the report is loud. We've examined the house. We've examined the truck. Now it's time to look at the destination itself, Server 319. Because to most people, an oil site looks like nothing more than tanks in a dirt field. Isolated. Low-tech. But that image is an illusion. In the modern oil and gas world, a site like Server 319 is a fortress of data. The site was monitored around the clock by a system called SCADA, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. Think of SCADA as the nervous system of an oil field. It tracks everything. Flow rates, temperatures, oil levels, and most importantly, internal pressure. These systems are incredibly sensitive. If a pipe leaks even slightly, SCADA knows. If pressure drops, alarms trigger. If the volume inside a tank suddenly changes, the system flags it immediately at the central control room. And that brings us to one of the most disturbing physical details of this case. Chris Watts admitted to forcing his 2 young daughters through the thief hatches at the top of the oil tanks. But we have to pause and look at the physics here. Those tanks weren't empty. They were filled with crude oil. When you force a solid object, especially a human body, into a sealed container of liquid, displacement happens. The oil level has to rise. Pressure inside the tank has to increase. That's not speculation. That's basic science. According to how SCADA works, that kind of sudden displacement should have triggered alarms instantly. High-level warnings. Pressure variance alerts. The system should have lit up like a Christmas tree. But on the morning of August 13th, it didn't. The system stayed silent. And that's where the official story starts to feel incomplete. Because this wasn't just physical labor. If the data stayed quiet, it suggests something else may have been happening in parallel, on the digital side. Chris Watts was a field operator. A mechanic. His job was hands-on. He fixed leaks. Turned valves. Checked wells. He was not an IT specialist. He didn't have administrative access to SCADA. He couldn't just log in, suppress alarms, or freeze data feeds. So the question becomes unavoidable. How did such a massive physical disruption happen without triggering the system designed specifically to detect it? That question leads us to a loophole investigators rarely discuss. While Chris was out in the field, who was back in the office? Who had access to safety systems? Who worked in environmental monitoring? Who had the credentials to view alerts, and potentially dismiss them as maintenance issues? His mistress. We know she worked for the same company. We know her role involved safety and compliance. That doesn't prove involvement, but it does raise a question. Was the silence at Server 319 just luck? Or was someone managing the digital footprint while Chris handled the physical evidence? So let me ask you this. Do you believe a field mechanic suddenly figured out how to bypass a multi-million-dollar monitoring system on his own? Or is it possible someone with office-level access helped clear the path? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because if Chris acted alone, he would have had to physically override sensors at the site, something that takes time and leaves traces. But if the system was manipulated remotely, that points to coordination. And coordination changes this from a crime of impulse into something much closer to a conspiracy. At this point, the coincidences start piling up. Access to the site requires keys. Access to the alarm systems requires passwords. And yet, on the exact morning Chris needed everything to go unnoticed, the one system designed to catch anomalies stayed quiet. SCADA is objective. It doesn't care about narratives. If that data was altered, or if alerts were suppressed, it suggests two roles in this crime, one at the hatch, and one at the keyboard. Here's the disturbing pattern we've uncovered so far. The house sensors should have caught him. The truck's internal systems should have raised questions. The oil site alarms should have sounded. All of them were designed to detect abnormal behavior. And yet, on August 13th, Chris Watts moved through these systems like a ghost. So how does a man whose job involved tightening bolts and changing filters suddenly outsmart a sophisticated surveillance network? He didn't have the training. He didn't have the access. Which means to understand how this happened, we have to step back from the morning of the murders and look at the night before. It's Sunday, August 12th. Shannon is stranded at an airport in Arizona, delayed by severe storms. Bella and Celeste are asleep in their beds. Chris is alone in the house on Saratoga Trail. And at exactly 9:28 p.m., he calls Nicole Kessinger. The call lasts 111 minutes. Nearly 2 hours. That's not a quick check-in. That's not a casual goodnight. Chris later told investigators it was just a relationship conversation. He said they talked about music lyrics, about dinner, about her frustration that his divorce wasn't moving fast enough. We're supposed to believe it was just emotional venting. But pause for a second and really think about that. If you're a man who has already decided your entire family will be dead by morning, do you spend 2 hours talking about song lyrics? Do you debate apartment leases when you know that in a few hours you'll be killing your pregnant wife? That explanation doesn't hold up. So maybe we need to stop calling this a conversation and start seeing it as something else. Because Nicole wasn't just a girlfriend. She was a safety and environmental specialist. Her job revolved around understanding risk, protocols, and how Anadarko monitored its sites. She understood SCADA. She understood alert thresholds. She understood blind spots. You don't spend 2 hours chatting about nothing the night before a murder. You talk about logistics. Now imagine that call without the romantic framing. When you align its length with the precision of what happened the next morning, the pieces start fitting together in a way that's deeply unsettling. Maybe the first part was about the house. Don't open the garage until the truck is running. If a basement sensor triggers, say you were grabbing tools. Then maybe the rest was about the site, where Chris needed the most guidance. He knew the mechanics. She knew the oversight. It's possible the conversation sounded more like this. Don't park near the intake valve. Open the thief hatch slowly. If the pressure spikes too fast, it could trigger an alert. Make sure the system is flagged as maintenance if anything looks off. This theory explains something important. Why Chris was so calm the next morning. Why he didn't hesitate. Why he moved with confidence instead of panic. He wasn't improvising. He was following a script. And what happened next only adds weight to that suspicion. After the murders, both Chris and Nicole engaged in an aggressive digital cleanup. Not just a few texts, but entire histories. Call logs deleted. Search histories wiped. Data erased, specifically from that critical time window. You don't destroy evidence unless it leads somewhere dangerous. If that call was innocent, if it was really just two people talking about a future together, why erase it completely? The deletions suggest awareness. They suggest fear of what that conversation would reveal. Those 111 minutes may be the missing link between Chris the ordinary mechanic and Chris the methodical killer. They may explain how he knew exactly what to do at the oil site, and how to do it without triggering alarms. He didn't get lucky. He didn't figure it out on the fly. And that realization forces us to ask a question many people still avoid. Was Chris Watts truly acting alone? He wasn't improvising. He was following instructions that likely came from someone who understood the system better than he ever could. If that phone call was really a step-by-step guide on how to get away with murder, then everything changes. So I want to ask you directly, do you believe she was coaching him? Yes or no? Let me know what you think in the comments. Because here's the real tragedy. While Shannon was stuck on a tarmac, exhausted, pregnant, and just trying to get home to fix her marriage, the man she trusted most was likely on the phone getting final approval to end her life. That call wasn't about love. It wasn't about patience. It wasn't about saving anything. It was about wiping out a family. And the silence of the SCADA alarms the next morning suggests that whatever was discussed that night worked. But if you think forcing his daughters into oil tanks was the lowest point of this nightmare, there's one more layer you need to hear, because Chris Watts wasn't done. There was a final act he intended to carry out. And if he had succeeded, we might not be talking about a murder case at all. We might be talking about a tragic industrial accident. When police searched Chris, they found something in his pocket that didn't get enough attention: a lighter. On its own, a lighter means nothing. But context matters. Chris was standing at Server 319, surrounded by crude oil tanks filled with highly volatile fumes. In the oil and gas industry, carrying an open flame near tank batteries is strictly prohibited. It's a fireable offense. It's incredibly dangerous. And it can be deadly. So why did he have it? In his later prison letters, Chris admitted the plan didn't end with hiding the bodies. He had considered igniting the site, either by shooting the tanks or lighting the fumes escaping from the thief hatches. Now take a moment and walk through that scenario. If he had pulled that trigger, or flicked that lighter, the explosion would have been catastrophic. Oil fires burn at extreme temperatures. The tanks would have been destroyed. The ground scorched. And most importantly, the bodies would have been completely consumed. No autopsies. No bruising. No soft tissue. No proof of strangulation or suffocation. Everything that later exposed the truth would have been erased. And the narrative would have changed instantly. Instead of a missing family and a suspicious husband, the headlines would read something very different. Tragic oil site explosion claims lives of workers' family. Chris could have said Shannon came to the site to talk, or bring him lunch. He could have described it as a horrible accident. A freak event. He would have been seen as the sole survivor. The grieving husband. Possibly even a victim of corporate negligence. He might not just have walked free, he might have been sympathized with. So why didn't it happen? Because the plan fell apart for the most ordinary reason imaginable. Time. While Chris was still trying to finish the scene, while he was burying Shannon and calculating how to ignite the tanks without killing himself, his phone rang. His coworkers were on their way. Their truck appeared on the access road earlier than he expected. And in that instant, panic set in. That moment saved the truth. There was no time to stage an explosion. No time to light a match. No time to finish the plan. He had to abandon it. He had to clean himself up. He had to act normal. He had to put the mask back on. And because of that interruption, because of that single miscalculation, we're able to piece this story together today. Not because Chris wanted the truth to come out, but because his plan wasn't finished. And that may be the most chilling realization of all.